I've known Mark for pretty close to 25 years now. Mark and I have been friends, involved in motorsport, raised our kids together, and it gives me great pleasure to introduce Mark to you because I'm so proud and impressed of what he's done over the years in his life. Mark was a Tim Hortons franchisee, significant franchisee holder for a number of years, and made the decision at the beginning of he and his wife Val, at the beginning of their business career, that they were going to undertake to hire disabled people. And very excited to announce that over the years that they owned their Tim Hortons franchises, they hired over 200 disabled people in their stores. So that represents about 17% of his workforce. And I remember in the beginning when Mark started his first store, he hired a young gentleman who had Down syndrome, and he stayed with Mark for all those years. And I learned so many lessons from Mark. Mark's also, in addition to being a world-renowned speaker, he's also part of the federal panel of labor initiatives. He's also a co-founder of the Canadian Business Sensibility. He's a recipient of the Meritorious Service Cross, Medal of Good Citizenship, and the Canadian Disability Hall of Fame. And just in my final introduction of Mark, I want to say, after all these years, buddy, I'm sorry when I crashed your car when you were in Ireland.
Glad you mentioned about crashing the car in Ireland, because I was going to tell you anyway. Let me tell you a little bit about Alistair Taylor. So we've known each other for 39 years, not 25, 39 years, Alistair. And about 30 years ago, I was racing in a series, and I had to miss one weekend because I was going to a wedding in Ireland. And it was decided that a former champion, Alistair Taylor, would race the car. And he crashed it into a concrete wall, hard. I mean, what could possibly go wrong with bringing an ex-champion out to drive the car, right? A few years later, we're sharing a Honda Civic in ice racing. Now, ice racing is a lot of fun, but it's slow. You're only doing 45 kilometers an hour, 50 kilometers an hour, because once you get up to speed, you have to slow down for the next corner. So what could possibly go wrong with Alistair driving an ice racer? He manages to roll the car and park it on its roof. So when this conference is over, if Alistair offers you a ride to the airport, choose wisely. So the message I have for you today, it's an important one. It resonates regardless of what or why you are here today. If you're an employer, if you're a person with a disability, if you're a stakeholder, if you're an activist or an advocate, it doesn't matter. The numbers I'm going to give you today, the data I'm going to give you today is important. It's important in terms of getting people jobs, people who have disabilities. And that's what we're going to talk about today. It's about work. It's about meaningful employment. Meaningful work, meaningful jobs for meaningful pay. And that affects all of us at some point in our lives. We're unemployed at some point in your life. You get out of school, you're looking for your first job. Or you're fired. You're made redundant. Company folds. You're looking for a job. You remember what it was like. It was frustrating. A week goes by, 2 weeks go by, 3 weeks go by. You're starting to get a little depressed. But eventually it happens. Eventually you get a job. Now imagine how much more difficult that will be if you happen to be a person who has a disability. Many times more difficult. Now, almost 18% of Canadians identify as having a disability. That's the entire population of Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and Alberta combined. That's a percentage of the population of Canada. Now, according to StatsCan, about 50 to 54% of those people are not working. Imagine that. 50 to 54% are not working. But we know that's a conservative number. There's about 500,000 recent graduates in Canada who have a disability from the last 5 years. About 500,000. 500,000 who have never worked a single day. Of those, 270,000 have a post-secondary education. Never worked a single day. Now, if you've never worked a single day in Canada, and you haven't paid income tax, and you haven't paid CPP, you can't be counted in unemployment numbers. So therefore, anecdotally, we believe the unemployment rate for people with disabilities in Canada to be closer to 70%. Closer to 70%. And only because you have a disability. If you look back in the Great Depression in the 1930s, the highest the unemployment rate went to in Canada was 24%. Yet here we are today with a perpetual depression for people with disabilities. And why is that? It's because employers, hiring managers, HR managers, CEOs, are still buying into a series of myths and misperceptions that if they hire somebody who has a disability, they'll work slower, be less productive, work in a less safe manner, be less innovative, need more time off, be sick more often, require more supervision, require expensive accommodations. They're all myths. They're all stereotypes. The opposite is actually true. And where do those attitudes come from? Societal attitudes towards people with disabilities. Well, one example is you just have to look at the comedian Jerry Lewis. Many of you remember Jerry Lewis. He was a funny comedian, but then he had those telethons. And what did he do? He put Timmy on his knee. And he taught us that people with disabilities are only worthy of our pity and can only do things if we help them. He knew the damage. Jerry Lewis knew well the damage he was doing. He raised a lot of money, yes. But that's where those attitudes come from. So the greatest barrier a person with a disability faces in order to get into the workplace is attitude. The attitude of society and the attitude of our employers. Attitude. Let me tell you a quick story about attitude. This is my favorite story about attitude. Now, I happen to be deaf. Up until recently, I was 98% deaf, but now I've got Bluetooth hearing aids, which have been very, very helpful. And I do a lot of presentations like this, mostly to business groups, and I have to travel a long distance to get to them, so I have to fly. So last year, I flew 80 times, so that shows you how often I'm in the airport and flying. I book all my flights on Air Canada, because Air Canada has been very good to me. Air Canada is my favorite airline. When's the last time somebody said that to you? I was speaking in Montreal a little while ago, and there were 2 Air Canada executives at the back, and they were cheering like you wouldn't believe. You guys must be from Air Canada. So I booked my flights online, tick off all the boxes, and it comes to a box that says, do you have a disability? Well, yes, I do. And as soon as I tick that box, there's a whole bunch of drop boxes that come down. Blind, deaf, service animal, user of a wheelchair, supporter of the Toronto Maple Leafs. Except for this coming year. So I tick off 2 boxes, and my boarding card shows that I'm deaf, which is fine, but it flags the system. It flags the system, and it tells Air Canada, and everyone working in that airport for Air Canada, it tells them that that particular day, on that flight, they have someone who might need some help. All I need is pre-boarding. I can't hear the announcements. I can't hear, how many times have you seen, when you're in the airport, they change the gate? I can't hear that. I think I'm getting on a plane to go to sunny Miami. They changed the gate. I'm getting on a plane going to Winnipeg in January. Air Canada has been great. And what does it cost them to do that? Nothing. And what do they get out of it? A lifelong customer. But as I travel around the world, I don't always get to fly on Air Canada. So a few years ago, I was in Germany, and I had to make a quick trip to Heathrow Airport the next day after I was presenting at a conference. And so I booked my flight on another carrier. Online, checked off all the boxes, and there was that box. Do you have a disability? Yes, I do. No drop boxes. So how in the world does the airport know what kind of disability is going to show up the next day? So the next morning, I go to Dusseldorf Airport. I go into the check-in counter, and the lady says, "Oh, Mr. Wafer, we've been waiting for you. Here's your wheelchair." That's not the first time that happened. So I said to her, "You know what? Since last night, I've had a miraculous recovery. Now I can't hear shit." Now, she didn't think it was funny. But you know what? Next time I'm going to take the wheelchair because you got through security faster. Deaf guy in a wheelchair. How bad can that be, right? Attitude. Think about how far that airline has to go to get where Air Canada is. And that's a major carrier. The attitude of the staff, the attitude of the owners, the attitude of the board of directors, they've got a long way to go. So back to the workforce. When you build capacity in your business of people with disabilities, you bring massive economic change to your business. I'm not talking about small incremental increases. I'm talking about massive financial success, massive economic improvements. So I'm going to give you some of the numbers. When I sold my business almost a year ago at 6 Tim Hortons, 200 of my employees did not have a disability, 46 did, which, as Alistair said, is about 70% of our workforce. And those 46 with all kinds of disabilities, every kind of disability, every department, including senior management. My absenteeism rate for my 46 employees who have a disability was 85% lower than the 200 who didn't. And anybody in this room who's in business will understand the cost savings of lower absenteeism. You look at safety. A person like myself who's deaf, I can't run across the street here without looking. Some of you can. You can hear if there's a bus coming or a Mack truck coming down the road. I can't. So I'm more aware of my surroundings. I work in a more safe manner. People who have various types of disabilities work in a more safe manner, just because that's the way it is. People with intellectual disabilities, for example, are very aware of their safety. They don't take chances. Accidents happen because we break the rules. Any accident that happened in any of my stores was always because somebody broke the rules. If you hire someone who's got cerebral palsy and they're in a wheelchair and they need something off the top shelf, they're not going to get out of the wheelchair and climb up on this table here to get something off the top shelf. No. You're going to get one of you guys to do that. And you're going to have the accident. Right? I could tell you this all day long anecdotally. I could give you stories. But listen to this. In 25 years of owning a Tim Hortons stores, thousands of employees, 200 of them with a disability, and never filled out a WSIB claim for a worker with a disability ever. I had the highest safety rating in my sector. You look at the innovation factor. So let's take that same person who's working for you who's got cerebral palsy. They get up in the morning, take a shower, get dressed, make breakfast, get in the elevator, go down to the parking garage, drive to work, quite possibly with hand controls. Everything they've done is done differently than the way we do it. It's the same with people who have low vision or people who are blind. They have different problem-solving skills. Innovation in the workplace is not created by hiring Einsteins. It's created by hiring regular people who have different problem-solving skills, who think differently. And people with disabilities have to think differently in order to get through their daily lives. And when you bring that into the workplace, the innovation factor goes up exponentially. IBM, for example, every year at graduation time at universities, they hire officers, and they grab everybody they see who has a disability and say, do you want to come work at IBM? And in IBM, you work in pods of 25 to 30. Every different department in one pod. And they make sure that they've got one or two people with an obvious disability in those pods because it drives innovation. And then we got productivity. Business owners always say to me, Mark, I can't afford to be an inclusive employer. Now, that works for you, but I can't afford to because I'm in a competitive marketplace. What do you think of Tim Hortons is? Competitive marketplace. They make the best widgets in the world, right? So they feel that because they're in a competitive marketplace, they can't afford to hire because productivity will be lower. So I'm going to come back to productivity in a little bit. I want to show you how I got started with this. So the gentleman on the picture on the right, that's Clint. When my wife and I opened our first store back in the early 90s, it was an existing store with a very busy clientele, and the owner had left to open another restaurant, another type of restaurant. He took all his staff with him. So here I am on day one with all these clientele, all these customers who had high expectations, you know, the way it is every day, and I've got all new staff, and we're struggling. And by the end of the day, the kitchen was a disaster, the dining room was a disaster, and I had a need. I had to put a notice on the door saying, we're hiring. Dining room attendant needed. And the person who walked through the door was Clint, 22 years old, just graduated from school, and Clint has Down syndrome. And up to this point in my life, I did not have a lot of experience being around people with intellectual disabilities, so I really didn't know what to expect. But what I did know is because of the barriers I faced as a young man growing up, I knew that if Clint just kept walking down the street, knocking on doors, looking for a job, he wasn't going to get one. I knew he wasn't going to get one. So I gave him a chance. And I brought in Community Living Toronto, a large community-based agency with job coaches. The job coaches helped me to train Clint. I didn't have the time. This is my first week as a Tim Hortons franchisee. I'm working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I'm sleeping on flour bags. So I don't have time to teach Clint. My manager didn't have time. You think all we do at Tim Hortons is sit in the kitchen and print money, right? We don't. No, we work hard in the first week. We do that in the second week. So after a little while, Clint came on board. We had to teach him how to take a bus. All the buses looked the same. He didn't know which one was his. And so it was great to have this agency. And of course, these agencies are all over Canada, and it's free of charge. It's free of charge to any business in Canada. So after a couple of weeks of Clint working, I realized he'd become our best employee. He came to work an hour before his shift. I couldn't get him to take a break. And I sure as heck couldn't get him to go home at the end of his shift. Now, where do you get that kind of loyalty in an employee? My staff were never allowed to wear their uniform to work because they get in a bus, they get in a subway, they come to work, it's contaminated, and then they start working with food. Not a good combination. So they have to carry their uniform to work and put it on when they get to work. But I had to make an exception for Clint, because Clint wanted everyone on that bus to know he works at Tim Hortons. Where do you get that kind of loyalty in an employee? Okay. The first year he worked for us, it was Christmas. He goes on his Christmas vacation, he goes to his aunt's house, and there's everybody there, aunts and uncles and brothers and sisters and neighbors and friends. They had a big family picture taken, and you guessed it, there he is in the back of the picture wearing his Tim Hortons uniform on Christmas Day. We had so much success with Clint that we decided to hire people with intellectual disabilities as our business grew. And our business grew fast. We had 6 restaurants in 5 years. And as I step back, this is 20 years ago, I step back and look at what's happening here. These people are not watching the clock. These people don't require any supervision at all. Because once you show them how to do a job, there's only one way to do it, the way you told them. They don't cut corners. Their productivity, therefore, was better than the rest of the staff. And so I started to see that there was a real economic case here. There's a real business case for hiring people with disabilities, being inclusive, and paying them a proper wage. And so we decided to open our doors to anyone with any kind of disability, as long as they could do the job or they could be trained to do the job. And the rest is history. There is not a disability type that I have not hired. And there is not a position in my business where we have not filled that position with someone who has a disability. Of course, the fit has to be right, as it would be with a person who does not have a disability. So I want to take you back to productivity for a second, because this is the one myth that employers can't get their head around. Is that someone who's missing an arm can have higher productivity than someone who had 2 arms. Or somebody who's in a wheelchair must have lower productivity than somebody who can walk. And this is a myth and a stereotype that is very difficult to get past employers. So I want to tell you about one of my employees who's not with me anymore, but she did work for us for quite a few years. Now, her name is Brigida. And I met Brigida at a presentation in Toronto, and she came up to me after the presentation, and Brigida is profoundly deaf. She cannot hear at all. And she says to me, "I'd like to come work in one of your stores." And so at that time, I had just renovated a restaurant, and we put in what we call a tandem team. So today it's common. You see it in Tim Hortons. You go in the morning when it's busy, there's 2 people serving you. One takes your order, the other one fills the order. But back in those days, this is 2011, this was a novelty, this was brand new. The second person is not even listening to you. They're looking at a computer screen. That's why it's perfect for somebody who's deaf. So I told Brigida about it and said, "Would you like to do it?" She said, "I'd love to do it." I said, "Can I see your resume?" She handed me her resume, and on the front page, it shows me that she graduated 3 years ago from Queen's University with an MBA. It's never worked. Never worked because she has a disability. It's the only reason she'd never worked. So I brought her in, went through the training, and put her on a tandem team. And I said to her, "I'm not in the business of creating charity. This job only pays 3 hours a day, because from 7 in the morning till 10 in the morning, it's when I need a tandem team. After that, I don't need it. And I'm not going to create hours for you where hours don't exist. Never do that." "That's okay, Mark. I want to do it." It was great. There was 3 cash registers in that store, 3 tandem teams, 3 lineups. The accommodation cost me 50 cents. It was a little card. It went on top of one of the machines and says, "Hi, my name is Brigida. I'm deaf. Please look at me when ordering." Within a couple of weeks, we noticed that when there was nobody at this cash register, there might be 5 people at Brigida's cash register, and a customer would walk in and join the end of the line. And we would say, "It's okay, these cash registers are open." "No, I want to be served by Brigida." That's the effect it had on customers. So I had an internal posting for a baker. And Brigida applied. She told me she was traveling 5 hours a day to work 3 hours. She was work 2.5 hours each way to do 3 hours. That's how desperate she was. That's the desperation that's out there, ladies and gentlemen. So she applies for this job as a baker. And in a Tim Hortons kitchen, the ovens all work on audible warnings. Now, we practice something called ATP, ask the person. We don't judge and say, Brigida, you can't do that job, you're deaf. We let her decide. So I said, take an hour, go in the kitchen, you figure out how you're going to do this job. I don't want you burning all my product, it's going to cost me money. She's back in 15 seconds. And she says to me, I have two questions. The first one is, what are the audible warnings for? I said, well, when the buzzers and all that go off, the product is ready, you take it out of the oven. She says, there's a timer on the oven too. What's that for? I said, well, when it gets to 0, the product is ready, you take it out of the oven. I'm deaf and I hadn't even figured this out yet. So she says, I get it, the buzzers are for lazy bakers. So she got the job. And she did a great job. But I don't give out medals for doing a great job. That's my expectation. My expectation is that you work to the best of your ability. But I noticed over time that Brigida was baking more and more product, more and more product. And in a Tim Hortons, you don't bake product unless it's going to sell. There's very little waste. We have computer systems, software packages, and everything that showed us what to bake and when. So I was able to do this, so I did a complete analysis of her work, and I found out that Brigida, who replaced a baker who'd been there for 9 years, had a productivity rate 18.7% higher than the person she replaced. She set the standard for the 27 bakers who were working in my business, and that standard lasted until the very day I sold those stores. The good news is for Brigida, we were able to get her a job using her MBA. She's now working at Deloitte, making 6 figures. When you go home today, I want you to remember the business case. I want you to remember the data and those numbers. But there's a human side to this as well. And I want to come back to Clint, because Clint and I sort of grew up together. I was in my early 30s when I started my business. I'm not in my early 30s today. And Clint's now 46 years old. And he worked with us every day from basically the first day until 11 months ago when I sold my 6 stores. And Clint is sort of a trailblazer. But back in the early 90s, it was very unusual for people with Down syndrome to be working. Even more unusual for them to be paid. And so there was a lot of media attention on Clint. He was interviewed by Peter Mansbridge. He's been in a number of magazines and newspapers. He has had a 1-hour documentary made on his life. He calls himself Captain Hollywood now. And he's grown up with us in the business. Now, Clint, on the spectrum of Down syndrome, Clint is below the 50th percentile. So he's quite challenged. So one day, a few years ago, I was approached by an organization that represents families who have children with intellectual disabilities, and asked me if I would come and speak to a group like this, but a group of families, moms and dads, who have young children with intellectual disabilities. And I turned it down. I turned it down because that's not my forte. What was I going to say? What could I possibly say that was going to give them hope? Because it sucks out there. So they came back to me and said, no, we really want you to do this. So I thought, what if I brought Clint with me? Because if the message comes from Clint, that's a whole different thing. So I said to Clint, what do you think? You want to go and do this? He said, yeah, I'll do it. So we did. We went to this, there was a smaller room than this, a smaller group, and moms and dads, and a small table at the front, and Clint and I were sitting at the small table, and he spent most of the time poking fun at me, but He told them about his job. He told them about his life. The fact that he's married his high school sweetheart in 2006, that he's got a condo, that he's living a full life, that he's paying taxes, that he loves his manager, everything. And you see the difference in the look on the faces of the people in the room an hour later when we were finished. And they left with some hope. Sometime after that, I received an email from an MP here in Ottawa asking me if I would come with Clint to Parliament Hill and sit down before the Standing Committee on Intellectual Disabilities and talk about our lives. For Clint to talk about his life and his job, and for me to talk about our hiring practices. So I said, Clint, what do you think? Now, this is going to be very different. This is going to be a little harder, Clint. This is not going to be families. You're joking with me, yes, but not so much as when we're with the families. What do you think? He says, I'll do it. I said, great. So we came up here to Ottawa, and we came in a room almost the same size as this, one big, massive U-shaped table. And there's 15 members from 3 parties. It's a bipartisan committee. And there's 15 MPs from the 3 parties. So Clinton and I walk in, and we sit at a table similar to this. I had a white tablecloth, I remember that. And slowly, the MPs come in. And each MP has 10 to 15 people with them. Assistant deputy ministers, executive assistants, and so on. And the MPs sit down, everybody else is around the wall. And before you know it, there's 150 people in that room. And behind the speaker, there's a whole bank of cameras. C-SPAN, CBC, Rogers, Shaw, everything was there. Even the radio stations were there. And on each person's seat on the table was a microphone. And we each had a microphone too. And everybody's talking. There's a real hubbub going on. And I look over at Clint, make sure he's okay, and he's the color of the white tablecloth. And I thought, okay, this is too much. We've gone too far now. I'm going to have to do all the talking, which is okay. The speaker calls for order. The hubbub dies down. All the little red lights on the cameras go on. All the little red lights on the microphones go on. And then, eventually, there's absolute silence. And Clint pushes the button on his microphone. He turns to me, and he says, would now be a good time to ask for a raise. It was the first time in many years all 3 parties were laughing at the same joke. It's funny, but it's profound. Here's a person who, if he didn't have that job, where would he be in life? What did that job do to him? Created a confident young man. A man who's contributing to society, to the economy, to himself and his family. That's what the job has done. So, there is, without question, a human side to this. In closing, I want to bring you back to the business case, and I want to give you one last number, and this is the figure you're going to leave here with today. Some people in business will look at what I said at the beginning of my speech, my presentation. I said up to 18% of Canadians have a disability. And it varies across Canada depending on the province. But the average is about 18. And they'll look at that, they think about their business, and they say, you know what, I don't see people with disabilities in my business. Even if it's a retailer, they say, I don't see too many people. They don't say it out loud. They're saying it to themselves. I think I can afford to ignore that. I don't need to get involved in this. Well, they would be wrong. Because if you take that 18% of Canadians who have a disability and you add in direct family members, that's mom, dad, brother, sister, son, daughter, you are now at 53% of the Canadian population. 53% of the Canadian population are directly affected by disability. They either have one or they have a loved one at home who has a disability. When I sold my 6 restaurants last October, I had 14,000 customers per day. 7,000 of those customers were directly affected by disability. And that's a number no one in business can afford to ignore. Thank you very much for having me here today.